Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and I built twice in the NZXT H7 Flow RGB 2024 edition so that I could show you what's possible with the case, talk about the various different things of interest and things to know before you build or before you purchase, and some of the highlights and lowlights of this case. As you can see, I built it with both NZXT single frame fans and Leland's SL120 V2 fans and its Hydro Shift all-in-one cooler. I've done a front-mounted push-pull setup with NZXT and then a top-mounted AIO with the Leland setup, as well as a vertical GPU mount. I want to show you some of the temperature differences that this leads to later on and some of the talking points. Although whether one or the other is more aesthetically pleasing is obviously going to be down to the end user. So let me know in the comments what you think. I personally prefer the Leland setup. However, there's definitely a lot to be said for these new NZXT single frame fans because they make life a lot easier. Now the case itself is a very nice one, I will say that. This is one of the nicer NZXT cases that I've seen. It comes up close to the H6 Flow RGB and the H9 Elite, both of which are also excellent. This has a variety of interesting highlights to it, and it's actually pretty capable. For example, you can use both eATX and ATX motherboards in this build. So you'll see here an MSI Godlike motherboard, which is eATX, slightly wider, takes up a bit more room, but there's a cable hiding bar which you can move side to side. So with an ATX motherboard, the standard setup here with the ASRock Live Mixer, you can move that cable hiding bar over to the left hand side here and hide things away a bit neater, or move it over to the right to make more space for an eATX motherboard. So you have the option there. You'll also notice some other things here. We have a recessed bay down the bottom for your fans, which is obviously perfect for the NZXT F360 single frame setup. Basically sits nicely in that recess. Now, if you're trying to use other fans, obviously you're going to have to think about how they fit. You can see the SL120 Infinity fans here are a little bit tricky to get in because there's a connector on the end for the cables, which kind of sticks into the edge of the socket there. It's a bit of a tight fit. It is possible, but if you have larger fans and if you have connectors on the end, they may well cause problems. However, I can tell you that you can fit 120mm fans in there. The SL120 V2 reverse blade fans will fit in there much more nicely than the Infinity fans because they have a smaller cable. You can also remove the connectors on the end of these interlocking fans so that you can make more space here as well, so they will slip in to that recess, so you can do that. Obviously, you can only put 120mm fans down here, though, 3 of those. As you'll see, there's holes at the bottom here, so there's no sort of run where you would normally have the ability to put 140mm fans. The other thing of note here is that there is no removable dust tray down the bottom. It has perforated holes on the underside, but there's no removable dust tray, so dust ingress may be a problem over time, and cleaning it might be an issue. It does have large feet, which help it sit high off the desk though, so airflow is good. As you can see, with a little bit of help from my smoke machine, it's got some nice space down there, and sucks nicely from below as well as from the front. Now the case itself comes with one single frame fan on the front, an F360 RGB core. As mentioned, the dust filters on the front are also lacking. So again, no removable dust tray here, but you do have some nice perforated holes for good airflow through the front of the case. The front fans are set up as intake, and they are quite nice looking and very easy to wire, which is one point I really like about this. As you'll have seen from one of these builds, I use multiples of these single frame fans in here, and as you can see, there are 3 connectors on it. You have a system fan header, an RGB header, and a 5-volt connection. So you have a choice of connecting these up directly to your motherboard rather than having to use an NZXT controller. So you can connect them up to a 5-volt header and a system fan header on your motherboard. A really simple wiring. I've done a separate guide on this which goes into a bit more depth on it, but the options are there. You can either choose to use NZXT's controller, as you'll see me do in a second, or wire them directly to your motherboard. Now you only have one fan included, but you can obviously buy extra of these, throw them in the case and keep a nice design throughout with uniformity in the fans that you're putting in there. The fact that they're so easy to wire now makes life a lot more straightforward because previously NZXT fans are a bit complicated, and that is thankfully no longer the case. Now I chose to use the front fans in setup with the Z73 Kraken cooler that I had on hand. and set up a push-pull setup in this case to be able to demonstrate how to do it, whether you should, etc. And I wanted to be able to show the intention here and the options for people to be able to see this, and obviously to be able to show the differences between front-mounted cooler and a top-mounted one as well. You could obviously just top-mount instead, but I have actually done tests in the past which show that having an intake on your all-in-one cooler can actually be beneficial because it can keep your CPU cooler. And this case is actually fairly spacious with the setup here. So bear in mind, I've got 6 fans on that front radiator. The tubes, I did find, got in the way a little bit during this build. And this was a bit problematic because when you go to put the GPU in place, the pump tubes are basically in the way. They're a little bit close to the GPU. They're pressing up against the rear of it. It wasn't ideal. But this is a 4090, so that gives you an idea of how much space there is. So you can still see it is possible to fit in here. One downside that I found with the 4090 though was that I had to screw it in from behind on the PCIe brackets. I couldn't do it in from the top, which was a small quirk. So there were a few oddities to the build here for sure. Just the tight fit at the rear made it impossible to screw those securing screws back into the PCIe brackets to secure the GPU. But if you're concerned about length, you can see that you can fit a push-pull setup in here and something as large as a 4090. So with a standard setup, obviously, that wouldn't be an issue. You could easily fit a graphics card in there. Now, in order to combat the tube problem, I thought maybe NZXT's vertical GPU mount might help. And as you can see, that won't work. Because of the way it's designed, it means that the GPU just won't fit in there then. Now, as you've seen, I do end up using this vertical GPU once the radiator's not there. And if I had only put the front fans on the radiator and not the ones that you can see on the end next to the graphics card, then it might not have been a problem. With a smaller GPU, it is possible to fit that in there, so a 4070 Ti will fit in. And as you can see, I've got the tubes from the RAD running over the edge there instead of behind it. So you do have a variety of options on how to install things. The rear of the case has been rethought slightly over the previous model with some changes. Now, one of the things that's either good or bad, depending on your outlook, is there's a removable tray behind the motherboard which you can attach both hard disk drives and SSDs to. I think this might be an issue because the drive used on hard disk drive doesn't have any anti-vibration mount, so you might find noise going through there. However, you could put 2 SSDs on there instead, and it is secured fairly nicely. Alternatively, you can put 2 SSDs down the bottom in this tiny little bay, so you have the option theoretically for 4 SSDs or 2 hard disk drives and 2 SSDs, and you can easily get a bunch of storage at the back, which is fairly easy to cable manage as well. So it's pretty straightforward to get a reasonable amount of storage in here. This little bay is tiny and kind of cute and fit nicely into the bottom of the case. Wiring it up isn't quite as easy as it is with that tray on the back of the motherboard plate though, which is one thing of note. Now, one of the things that's nice about the design of this case at the rear is you'll see there's a lot of channeling for your cables and a lot of Velcro ties there. I've used 2 different power supply units in the 2 builds. One was the Leland Edge power supply unit that you can see here, with these nice flat cables on it that you could easily run under the various Velcro ties and points throughout the case to tidy things up. But it will fit nicely with other power supply units. The NZXT PSU that I used in the first time build of this case also fit nicely in here, and you can see there's plenty of space for running those cables through. That cable hiding bar at the front also does a good job of hiding away your cables from view, meaning that you can keep things nice and neat. One downside I did find was that the 8-pin CPU power cables for the motherboard here caused issues, sort of interfered with the hard disk drive, but that might be down to the length of the cables from the power supply unit. Now, the hard disk drive cage and SSD cage is removable from behind the motherboard, so if you do need to access it to get to the back plate to install all-in-one cooler bracketing, you can do that. So that's fairly easy to remove. It is held in place with a screw rather than the thumb screw, so it's a little bit more fiddly, and putting it back again obviously interferes with those power cables for the CPU thing, but this is a minor inconvenience in what is otherwise an interesting and pretty useful setup. Also, as you can see, wiring things in was pretty straightforward. I did, however, have some issues with wiring in Lee's controller. Because of the length of the cable, I couldn't find a good place to put the controller for the SL120 V2 fans. You can see it ended up basically putting it on the left-hand side. If you're using an NZXT controller, that's got a nice little spot where it'll sit at the top here, and I found that was less of an issue. So it was really easy to plug all the cables in here, with the exception of one cable where the length of it wouldn't really allow it, and I ended up having to plug it in to the all-in-one cooler instead. But whatever the case, both builds, on one time I was really neat with the cable management, and on the other pass-through I was really messy, and I did that intentionally because I wanted to be able to show how easy it was to shut the door. And as you can see, the rear panel also has a venting for your power supply unit to keep that nice and cool. So we ended up with two quite different builds here, with quite a different aesthetic and design to them, obviously with their own benefits. In theory, you'll get better cooling on your CPU with that front-mounted cooler, but maybe that might interfere with the cooling of the graphics card. Obviously, you also have the option of vertically mounting your GPU, as I've mentioned. NZXT's vertical GPU mount fits perfectly in this case, and you'll notice there's a little tray along the bottom edge of the case where the cables come from below, so you can run your power supply cables up for the GPU there. But also this vertical GPU mount will sit nicely on that because there's a little foot on the bottom which will adjust and just tuck on the edge there of that tray, so it can be secured in there, and then it ends up looking quite nice. It's also sitting quite far back from the glass, so it shouldn't necessarily be a problem. However, as other people have pointed out in some of the comments on the previous videos, there's a big gap between the bottom fans and the GPU. It looks like a massive bit of wasted space there, but obviously that's a very subjective opinion. Now, the panels pop on really easily and it goes back together really nicely, and I will say it was really easy to build in. The design of this case is really well thought out. I like the cable management sort of hiding areas and the way you can run the cables from below the motherboard at an angle so you can keep things nice and neat, and the end result looks really nice. It's a really nice looking setup here, I think. It's going to vary depending on what you put in it naturally and how good you are at wiring things in, but it ends up looking pretty sweet. I will say as well, with the Lee fans, it ends up being a bit quieter. Now, I wanted to run some tests, although obviously I've got quite a different setup here, so you will need to take these benchmarks and test with a pinch of salt, because naturally I've got a vertical GPU mount, different GPUs, and different fans and all-in-one coolers. But what I found is the performance was good across both, although I did notice that the vertical GPU mount meant the graphics card ran a little hotter. You can see about 65 degrees C in Red Dead Redemption benchmark testing and in general gameplay, and that experience was the same across a variety of games. So you can see me playing Bell right here, for example, and I played some PUBG on it, as well as doing the various different benchmarks with 3D Mark, and the experience was about the same. Now, the fans were set to quiet, and what I did find is that both the CPU fans and the fans in general ran quite quietly, even under a reasonable load. So in this setup, it's actually quite quiet, although as I mentioned, the graphics card is running quite hot in some areas, especially when I put it under heavy load. So I did some thorough benchmarking and stress testing with both Steel Nomad and Port Royal, and what I found is, although the temperatures here showed roughly getting around 66 degrees on the GPU and somewhere just below 50 degrees on the CPU, hardware monitor showed that we actually hit up to 95 the package at one point, and got quite toasty on the CPU and then reasonably hot on the graphics card as well, up to 92 degrees on the memory, 67 max on the GPU itself. Now, these are high-end specs. It's an i9 and a 3090 in this pass of the test, so they are expected to run quite hot. But I think that the vertical GPU mounting will make your GPU a little bit toastier, because obviously it's putting it at a bit of a strange angle. The experience with the i9 is also going to be affected depending on what motherboard you're running in the BIOS, because I've done a video separately on this, but there have been some issues with BIOS settings causing very hot temperatures of the CPU. But with that, HydroShift AIO is actually getting pretty good temps in there. Now, if we take a look at this similar sort of testing with the NZXT setup, I did find it was noisier under load, which I'll get to in a second. And as you can see, the CPU temps actually got quite a bit hotter. You can see the packages were up to 100 degrees. Now, this is fairly unusual because I have found in the past that front mounting an all-in-one cooler or side mounting it is actually pretty good. And with a push-pull setup, it should in theory run cooler because you're getting a lot of cold air through that radiator. But actually in this test, I found that it wasn't as cool. So the CPU temps are higher, you can see overall, during my testing and stress testing here. And it was certainly noisier with this setup as well, which is one downside to it. But again, as I said, experience will vary. It really depends on the setup, obviously environmentals and your fans in general, and other things that you've got, settings in the BIOS, for example, or even your motherboard can have a big impact on that. And I'll leave links in the description to other videos that explain this in a bit more depth. But my experience is that I really like both setups, if I'm honest. But you do have to make sure you set your system up properly, because one of the things I thought initially was that the fans and the NZXT single frame fans were ridiculously loud, and that it was very obnoxious under load especially. But the actual testing revealed it wasn't that at all, but it was this tiny little drive, NVMe SSD, which spins up really fast as default and ends up overpowering all the fans in the case, which was pretty nuts. So adjusting that with the fan control software and turning the RPMs down on that made a difference. And then I discovered it wasn't quite as loud with the NZXT setup in the end. So overall, a really nice case. Easy to build in, has some very nice highlights to it. It's very flexible, it's good looking, especially when you've got it tidied up and set up nicely with a good looking system. And it's a reasonably affordable, and also includes one of those single frame fans as standard, which is definitely a very nice addition to the system. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, check out the links in the description to other related content, and thanks very much for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.